One was Harlem's calculated godfather, who built an empire on strategy and respect. The other claimed to be his protege and successor, the man who revolutionized the heroin trade. But were Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas really allies? Or is their legendary connection one of the biggest lies in crime history? This is the story of two of the most famous black gangsters in American history, and the truth behind their relationship that Hollywood got completely wrong. What do you think you know about Bumpy and Frank? Most of it is fiction, and the reality is far more complicated, controversial, and revealing than the movies ever showed. If you're here for the real history, not the Hollywood version, not the sanitized legends, but the documented truth about Harlem's underworld, hit that subscribe button now. We're about to separate fact from fiction in one of the most misunderstood relationships in crime history. In 2007, the movie American Gangster hit theaters and told the world a story. Frank Lucas, a North Carolina country boy, came to Harlem and became the protege of the legendary Bumpy Johnson. When Bumpy died in 1968, Frank took over, revolutionizing the heroin trade by cutting out the middlemen and importing drugs directly from Southeast Asia. He built a multimillion-dollar empire, became richer than the Italian mob, and ruled Harlem until his arrest in the 1970s. It was a compelling story. Denzel Washington played Frank Lucas with charisma and menace. The film portrayed him as a strategic genius who learned from the master and surpassed him. There was just one problem. Most of it wasn't true. The real relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas, if it existed at all, was nothing like the movies portrayed. And the exaggerations, embellishments, and outright fabrications that Frank Lucas told about himself reveal something deeper about how we create legends, especially around black criminals. This is more than a story about two gangsters. It's about myth-making, cultural memory, and the dangerous gap between what actually happened and what we choose to believe. So let's break it down. Who were these men really? What was their actual relationship? And why does the truth matter? Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905 and arrived in Harlem as a teenager in 1919. Over the next 5 decades, he became one of the most powerful and respected figures in Harlem's underworld. We've covered Bumpy's life extensively in this series, so here's the essential summary. Bumpy wasn't just muscle, he was a strategist. He read philosophy, studied military history, and understood power as a game of psychology, loyalty, and calculated risk. He worked alongside Madame Stephanie St. Clair in the 1930s, survived the war with Dutch Schultz, and eventually formed strategic alliances with Italian crime families while maintaining black operational control over Harlem streets. By the 1950s and 60s, Bumpy was the undisputed godfather of Harlem. Not because he was the most violent, but because he was the smartest and most connected. He controlled the policy racket, numbers game, mediated disputes, protected the community, and operated with a level of sophistication that earned respect from criminals, residents, and even law enforcement. Here's what made Bumpy different from typical gangsters. He was a community figure. He wasn't just extracting wealth from Harlem. He was embedded in it. He supported black-owned businesses, helped families in need, mediated neighborhood disputes, and represented a form of black power and autonomy that was rare in an era of systemic oppression. When Bumpy walked Harlem streets, people greeted him with respect, not just fear. Elderly women waved. Kids knew his name. Shopkeepers felt safer when he was around. That reputation was built over decades of consistent behavior, strategic intelligence, and genuine community connection. By 1968, when Bumpy died of a heart attack at age 63, he was a legend. His funeral was attended by hundreds of Harlem residents who mourned not just a criminal, but a protector and a symbol of black resilience. That's the Bumpy Johnson that actually existed, complex, intelligent, deeply rooted in Harlem's fabric. Now let's talk about Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas was born in 1930 in La Grange, North Carolina, a small, rural town where he witnessed racist violence that shaped his worldview. According to his own accounts, which should always be taken with skepticism, he saw the Ku Klux Klan murder his cousin, an experience that left him with a deep hatred for white authority and a determination to gain power by any means necessary. Lucas came to Harlem in the late 1940s or early 1950s. Accounts vary. He started as a small-time hustler, running errands, committing petty crimes, and trying to survive in a city far more complex and dangerous than rural North Carolina. In interviews later in life, Frank Lucas claimed he quickly came under the wing of Bumpy Johnson, becoming his driver, bodyguard, and eventually his protege. He said Bumpy taught him the game, introduced him to powerful connections, and positioned him to take over after his death. According to Lucas, when Bumpy died in 1968, Frank stepped into the void and revolutionized the heroin trade. His innovation, the Blue Magic heroin brand, and the claim that he smuggled drugs directly from Southeast Asia in the coffins of dead American soldiers, became the centerpiece of his legend. By the early 1970s, Lucas was supposedly making $1 million per day, living in mansions, driving luxury cars, and operating an empire that rivaled the Italian mafia. Here's the problem. Almost none of that story holds up under scrutiny. Historians, journalists, and people who actually knew Bumpy Johnson have consistently disputed Frank Lucas's version of events. And the more you dig into the documented evidence, the more Lucas's claims fall apart. So what's the truth? Let's separate myth from reality. If you're already seeing how much Hollywood distorted this story, drop a like on this video. It helps more people discover the real history behind the myths. Let's examine Frank Lucas's central claim, that he was Bumpy Johnson's protege, driver, and eventual successor. What Frank Lucas claimed. In interviews with journalists, in his collaboration with the book and film American Gangster, and in various media appearances, Lucas consistently portrayed himself as Bumpy's right-hand man. He said, he worked as Bumpy's driver and bodyguard for 15 years. Bumpy taught him the heroin business and introduced him to suppliers. When Bumpy died in 1968, Frank inherited his operation and connections. He revolutionized the drug trade, using lessons learned from Bumpy. What the evidence shows. Here's where Lucas's story crumbles. 1. Timeline problems. Bumpy Johnson was imprisoned from 1952 to 1963, 11 years. During that time, he was in federal custody, including time at Alcatraz. He couldn't have been mentoring Frank Lucas in Harlem during those years, because he wasn't in Harlem. When Bumpy was released in 1963, he was 58 years old and focused on re-establishing his control over the policy racket and his traditional operations. He died just 5 years later in 1968. That leaves a very narrow window for Lucas to have been Bumpy's driver and protege, and no credible evidence supports it. 2. Witness testimony. People who actually knew Bumpy Johnson, family members, associates, community members, have consistently said they never saw Frank Lucas around Bumpy. His daughter, granddaughter, and longtime associates have all disputed Lucas's claims. Mamie Johnson, Bumpy's widow, explicitly stated in interviews that Frank Lucas was not Bumpy's driver or protege, and that Bumpy never trusted or relied on him the way Lucas claimed. 3. Bumpy's known associates. Bumpy Johnson's actual inner circle is well documented. His trusted lieutenants and associates were men he'd worked with for decades, people who'd proven their loyalty, intelligence, and capability over years of operation. Frank Lucas doesn't appear in any of those circles. He wasn't mentioned in police reports about Bumpy's operations. He wasn't identified in surveillance records. He wasn't part of the network that maintained Bumpy's interests during his imprisonment. So what's the truth? Most evidence suggests Frank Lucas was, at best, a low-level hustler on the periphery of Harlem's underworld during Bumpy's lifetime, not a trusted protege or successor. But if Lucas wasn't Bumpy's protege, how did he become powerful? And why did he lie about their relationship? Let's dismantle the key myths about Frank Lucas one by one. Myth number 1. Frank Lucas was Bumpy Johnson's driver and protege. Reality. No credible evidence supports this. Bumpy's family and actual associates deny it. The timeline doesn't work. Lucas likely had minimal contact with Bumpy, if any meaningful contact at all. Why Lucas lied? Claiming connection to Bumpy Johnson gave Lucas credibility and legend. Bumpy was respected, feared, and beloved in Harlem. By positioning himself as Bumpy's chosen successor, Lucas was trying to inherit that respect and legitimacy. Myth number 2. Frank Lucas smuggled heroin in the coffins of dead soldiers from Vietnam. Reality. This is the most famous claim from American Gangster, and it's almost certainly false. Federal prosecutors, DEA agents who investigated Lucas, and military officials have all said there's no evidence this ever happened. The logistics would be nearly impossible, the risk enormous, and the claim appears nowhere in Lucas's actual criminal case files. Even Richie Roberts, the prosecutor who convicted Lucas, played by Russell Crowe in the film, said the coffin story was fabricated for dramatic effect. Why Lucas lied? It made him sound like a genius who discovered an undetectable smuggling route. It made for a great story. And Lucas knew that dramatic stories sell books, movie rights, and interviews. Myth number 3. Lucas made $1 million per day and was richer than the mafia. Reality. While Frank Lucas was certainly involved in heroin trafficking and made significant money, the scale he claimed is wildly exaggerated. Financial records from his arrest and prosecution show wealth measured in hundreds of thousands, not the multimillions he claimed. The idea that a black drug dealer in 1970s Harlem was more powerful than the Italian mafia families that controlled wholesale drug importation is not supported by any evidence. Lucas was a street-level distributor who likely had some success, but he was never the kingpin he portrayed himself as. Why Lucas lied? Exaggeration made him famous. And fame, even criminal fame, can be monetized through book deals, consulting, and media appearances. Myth number 4. Lucas's blue magic heroin was higher quality because he bypassed the mafia. Reality. Blue magic was likely just a marketing brand name for heroin that wasn't significantly different from competitors. The claim that Lucas bypassed Italian middlemen and sourced directly from Southeast Asia is disputed by law enforcement records. Most evidence suggests Lucas worked with various suppliers, some legitimate, some criminal, but wasn't operating some revolutionary independent supply chain. So why does this matter? Why spend time debunking Frank Lucas's lies? Because these myths shape how we understand Harlem's history, black criminal enterprise, and figures like Bumpy Johnson. When Lucas fabricated his connection to Bumpy, he was stealing Bumpy's legacy and rewriting history to center himself. And when Hollywood amplified those lies in American Gangster, millions of people came to believe a false narrative about Harlem's underworld, one that diminished the actual figures who shaped it and elevated a liar who exploited their reputations. For our communities, accurate history matters. The truth about who Bumpy Johnson was, what he represented, and who actually carried his legacy forward matters. Frank Lucas's lies aren't harmless storytelling, they're erasure. Here's a question for you. Why do you think Frank Lucas felt the need to fabricate his connection to Bumpy Johnson instead of just telling his own story? Was it about respect, legitimacy, or something else? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear different perspectives on this. Let's talk about what both men actually meant for Harlem. Not the myths, but the documented reality. Bumpy Johnson's impact. Bumpy operated during a specific era when Harlem needed figures who could navigate between legitimate community needs and underground economies. He provided economic opportunity, jobs in the policy racket for people locked out of mainstream employment, community protection, mediation of disputes, protection from outside predators, black autonomy, maintaining black operational control despite Italian mob pressure, institutional knowledge, decades of strategic thinking and relationship building. Bumpy's legacy is complex. He was a criminal, but he represented black power and community connection in ways that mattered to Harlem residents who lived through systemic oppression. Frank Lucas's impact. Lucas operated during the heroin epidemic of the 1960s and 70s, one of the most devastating periods in black urban history. Heroin destroyed families, killed thousands, and contributed to the decline of neighborhoods like Harlem. Whatever success Lucas had came at enormous community cost. Unlike Bumpy, who operated the policy racket, a vice with limited direct harm, Lucas trafficked in a drug that killed people and devastated communities. Lucas wasn't a community protector. He was a predator, and his lies about being Bumpy's protege were an attempt to steal the legitimacy and respect that Bumpy had actually earned through decades of community engagement. Here's the ultimate truth about their relationship. They probably barely knew each other. Bumpy Johnson was an old-school operator who'd survived 50 years in Harlem's underworld through intelligence, discipline, and community relationships. Frank Lucas was a hustler who got into heroin trafficking during the worst drug epidemic in urban history, and then spent the rest of his life lying about his accomplishments to sell a story. The fact that Hollywood turned Lucas's lies into a blockbuster film tells us more about our appetite for criminal legends than it does about historical reality. And that raises the final question: why do these myths persist? And what does it cost us when we believe lies instead of honoring the complicated truth? The legacy of Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas reveals something crucial about how we tell stories, especially about black criminals. Why Frank Lucas's lies worked. 1. People wanted to believe them. The idea of a black gangster outsmarting the Italian mafia and getting rich is appealing, especially to communities that have been systematically oppressed. 2. Hollywood amplified them. American Gangster was a well-made, entertaining film, but it sacrificed historical accuracy for drama. 3. Lucas was a good storyteller. He told his lies consistently, confidently, and with enough detail that people believed them. 4. Bumpy was dead. Dead men can't dispute lies told about them. Lucas exploited Bumpy's reputation, knowing he couldn't be contradicted. The cost of these myths. When we accept Frank Lucas's fabricated version of history, we dishonor Bumpy Johnson's actual legacy and the people who knew him, erase the real figures who shaped Harlem's underworld during that era, perpetuate false narratives about how criminal enterprises actually operated, let liars profit from stolen legacies. What we should remember: Bumpy Johnson was a real, complex figure who represented black power, intelligence, and community connection during a specific historical moment. He was flawed, criminal, and morally ambiguous, but he was also strategic, loyal, and deeply embedded in Harlem's fabric. Frank Lucas was a heroin dealer who caused significant harm to black communities and then spent decades lying about his accomplishments to sell a narrative that wasn't true. They weren't friends. They weren't mentor and protege. They probably barely knew each other. And the truth matters, because our history matters. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas is one of the most misunderstood stories in American crime history, not because it was complicated, but because it barely existed. Frank Lucas built a legend on lies, stealing the reputation of a man who'd actually earned respect through decades of strategic intelligence and community engagement. Hollywood amplified those lies because they made for good cinema, and millions of people came to believe a version of Harlem's history that never happened. This isn't just about two criminals. It's about how we construct myths, especially around black figures. It's about the gap between what actually happened and what we choose to believe. And it's about why accurate history matters, even when the truth is less dramatic than the fiction. Bumpy Johnson's real legacy doesn't need embellishment. He was brilliant, strategic, and deeply connected to Harlem in ways that shaped the neighborhood for decades. His story stands on its own. Frank Lucas's legacy is one of exaggeration, fabrication, and exploitation of communities, of truth, and of Bumpy Johnson's actual reputation. The choice of which story we tell, which narrative we believe, and whose legacy we honor reveals who we are and what we value. Choose truth. Choose complexity. Choose the real history over the comfortable lie. Because our ancestors, flawed, complicated, and deeply human, deserve to be remembered accurately, not exploited for someone else's profit. If this breakdown of myth versus reality opened your eyes to how much we've been lied to about Harlem's history, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're committed to telling the real stories, not the Hollywood versions, but the documented, evidence-based truth about black history, power, and survival. Next up, we're exploring the heroin epidemic of the 1970s, its impact on Harlem, and the community's fight for survival during one of its darkest periods. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what surprised you most about the truth behind Bumpy and Frank's relationship, and share this with anyone who needs to know the real history. This is our legacy, our truth, and it's time we stopped letting liars steal it. See you in the next one.